All right, we are ready to move on to the leaf stitch. I am using 3 strands again, so we're going to demo this one in 3 strands, and I'm going to stay with the same yellow so that I can keep it organized how many strands I'm using with which color. So I like keeping it all organized that way. So the leaf stitch. So for the leaf stitch, because they are all a little bit of a different shape, that's the goal, is to show you a few variations of the same shape. But for this, how I've sort of determined where I start my first stitch is kind of where the widest part begins. So if you're looking at this leaf stitch, it gets to its widest point about right here. So that's where I'm going to go. Normally that is about, I don't know, like 40% down the pattern, maybe a little more or less depending. And it's kind of a guesstimate. You don't have to be on that exactly. It's just how I've noticed that I tend to go. And then your second stitch is going to come up just down. I like to, especially if it's meant to look like this, make sure that I'm giving a good little gap between the middle stitch and the next stitch, because we want to really accentuate that point. And I keep it as close to that center point as possible. And then my next stitch will come down just after it on the same line. You can go as close as possible, about like 1 needle's length away, if that makes sense. So you would be able to fit 1 stitch between it. And then same thing on the other side, we're coming up following that line, but just down from the middle stitch. And then for this pairing, when you're pairing on each side, I come down through pretty much the same hole. I don't leave that gap. If they are a stitch length away, it's just because I've gone directly below it, so I'm not leaving that 1 needle's length between them. They kind of have a pair. And as the shape of the leaf changes, like if you have one side that's quite a bit bigger and you're going to need more stitches, that may not apply. You may be like staggering it a little bit more. You might be sliding a stitch between those gaps. You don't have to be exactly precise with going 1 for 1 because they're not identical twins each side of the leaf. But I do like to meet up. And sometimes your leaf will have a guideline and sometimes it won't. If you want to draw your own guideline, you can. Or you can kind of eyeball it, but essentially you are going down pretty much the center of the leaf. If it's a very curvy leaf, you basically just want to split the leaf in the middle and then adjust that middle as you keep going from the top. So you would follow the curve kind of. You want to think of it, on this one I think I made a little bit too big of a gap. You kind of want to think of it as like the veining of a leaf. When you look at a leaf and it has that line down the center, what would be the natural direction of that leaf? So if you're working on a pattern and it doesn't have a line down the middle, which lots of the time it won't, which is fine, you might want to look, if you're struggling with that, if you're saying to yourself, I'm going to draw a line on it, and you're struggling with where exactly to draw the line, I've at times looked up on Google Images lines or leaves to see kind of how they naturally curve that line through the center, how that veining looks, just to get, an idea so that I'm confident in what a real leaf would look like. Might be a little self-explanatory to some, but not everything that comes easily to some of us comes easily to the others. And I know some people really do like to be precise. And the closer together your stitches at the top are, the smoother the edge here is going to look. So if these are really gapped apart, you're going to see those lines. If they're really close together, you'll almost look like you're getting a full straight line. Can't remember which side I did my last stitch on now. The other thing I'll say is if you have a pre-printed fabric like I do, you can see that that line underneath is visible. If you want to try to cover it, you can make sure that you're coming up on the outside of that line if you're working on a pre-printed fabric in the future, especially if it's made with a black line instead of a colored line. So different pre-printed fabrics are a little bit different. They're all a little different. Some of them have a colored pattern underneath, and some of them just have like a guideline, which would be black. If it's black like that, you really want to make sure you're covering the guidelines. See how you can see that black there? It just doesn't look as clean. If it was yellow, you wouldn't notice it. It would just, you might not see it quite as much. So that's something to keep in mind when you're working with pre-printed fabrics. In this case, I'm not trying to cover that line, so it's fine. So when you're doing something like a leaf stitch, our 6-strand leaf stitch is going to be only a few stitches. It's going to be bulkier. It's going to be a thicker stitch. I might actually, maybe I'll demonstrate that one for you guys just since, and it's just going to look very different. Now, it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea to have a 6-strand leaf stitch. A 1-strand leaf stitch on this would be teeny tiny little stitches. It would take quite a long time to do. So I did 3, 4, and 6 to just give you an idea of the different sizes. But again, if this was 3 times the size, you would want 6 strands maybe. But sometimes we like the bulkier look and sometimes we like the thinner look. So that is the goal of this, is to get an idea of all of them. They'll always change though, even on a larger pattern, a larger size of the leaf, the size of the flower petal. Those are all variables that will change how a pattern looks. On a huge leaf, doing 1 strand may look great if you're blending threads, but it also might just be tedious and time consuming when 3 strands would also be effective to get the nice smooth look. Okay, so quickly while I'm here, I'm going to actually do 6 strands for you guys because I want to show you how different that will look. So I'm going to grab that and I'll be right back. Okay, 6 strands on a small leaf like this is going to look very different than 6 strands or 3 strands on a small leaf like this. So we're going to start by coming up through the center, doing the same thing, kind of finding the widest point. I think it's about like here, so it's a little longer down than the other one. Okay, so we've got our first stitch, and then I'm doing the same thing. I'm just coming up kind of below, and then just a stitch length away again. Oops, just finding the right spot. Okay. And then meeting up with that stitch. Pulled a little bit of my knot through. All right. Okay, so as you can see, I'm just even with 2 stitches or 3 stitches, I'm quite a bit further than I would have been when I was working with 3 strands. So it does just fill it in obviously quicker is one part of it because you're working doubles, or you're doing about half the stitches. But it also creates like these more visible lines. The stitches don't blend together as much. You can see each stitch as almost like its own individual line. Now on a massive leaf on a big 6-inch hoop, those big lines would blend together differently than they do on a tiny leaf like this. So again, size and context matter, but we're just doing the same technique. It's coming quicker to the bottom though. Leading up for each stitch. And then this last one, this one here is going to go all the way to the bottom. And then I'll show you how we're going to round out the edges. Now, the one thing that I actually didn't talk about on our 3 strands was when you get to that edge. And looking at it now, I actually think I stopped a little short of what I should have on this one, and I'll kind of show you what I'm saying. If you see right here, if this black line wasn't here, this would be a pretty sharp. This pattern deserved one more stitch, kind of like I did on this side where the stitch ended up, you know, covering that stitch. Should have put one more stitch and just still meeting up in that center point. On this one, I've already filled in the center point, so my middle base is kind of gone. So now I need to finish out this side of the leaf, and I'm just going to stitch up around that curve a little bit while still keeping the same angle. And what I like to do is I kind of hold this on the outside so that when it comes down, it tucks beside or underneath the stitch that was already there. If I'm pulling straight down, it sometimes ends up laying on top of the other stitches, which isn't what I want. Just guiding it into the space I want it. So then this last one, I'm going to tuck it in as close as possible to the last stitch I made, sometimes even tucking it in behind so that it creates the right curve that I want. And you see how that just really curved in because I'm starting out here, but I'm curving it into the base of the petal. And the same over here. So as you can see, once I kind of got to the point where I was done matching the stitches up, I worked on one side at a time. That's a personal preference. You don't have to do it that way. I just like to because I feel like it allows me to focus on the side I'm doing instead of trying to flip back and forth. Okay, and then for my last stitch, I'm going to try to do the same thing where I'm curving it out. So I'm coming right beside the last stitch, but almost in behind it to create that curve. Okay, and I actually think I have one more stitch in me. Just looking at the shape that I have, I want to finish off this bottom part. So because this one was a little wider at the bottom on this side, just tuck it in underneath. So when you're tucking it in underneath, it just so that it creates not like you don't want a sharp end here. You don't want to be able to see where that stitch ends, kind of like a blunt end. So by tucking it underneath, it kind of blends them in together and rounds it out a little bit. So now that we're finished with our leaf stitch, I'm going to hop down and work on our satin stitch. We'll come around, we'll do our French knots, and then we're going to jump back up to this pistol stitch since the French knot is kind of a variation. And then we'll work our way around the rest of the pattern.